All right, we're going to keep us rolling today into our first panel of the day. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sarah Bartlett. I work for Potential Energy Consulting. I have a long career working in oil and gas and other environmental health and safety issues related to oil and gas. And I'm very excited to moderate this panel with these two folks here. So with me, I have Commissioner Brett Ackerman. He was appointed as a commissioner in 2022, and before that had over 20 years with CPW. A fun fact about him, his first assignment at CPW was actually in rifles, so it all comes full circle with him here today. I really appreciate and admire him for his leadership in cumulative impacts. That's what we're here as a panel to talk to you about today. So very thankful to have him here with us. And with him is Joe Evers. Joe is a policy manager at Occidental Petroleum. He works on state and federal issues across 4 states in the West, including Colorado. And a fun fact about him, he owns half of a racehorse.
I assume he'll tell us which half.
Yes.
Back.
You got to come ask him those fun questions later at the happy hour. That's the point of these fun facts. So we're here to give a very brief discussion of cumulative impacts and its status in the state, or its where it is right now. There's a long history of cumulative impacts in Colorado. Well, long. It's a history longer than in other places, but we're going to cover a little bit of the history today, and then I'm very pleased to have Commissioner Ackerman with us to share a little bit of where the COGCC is going. So we're going to jump right into questions. We will have some time, a few minutes at the end for questions as well. So we'll start with a question for Brett. Can you please start with an overview of the history of cumulative impacts in Colorado?
Sure, you bet, and I am happy to be here. Thank you, I appreciate the question. And Sarah's right, the cumulative impacts of oil and gas development in Colorado does have a long history. Lots of times we like to just move on to what we're doing and where we're going and what still needs to be done, but we really do have a long history of assessing and addressing cumulative impacts of oil and gas development in Colorado. Sarah mentioned that I was a DWM out here in Rifle, and there was oil and gas development certainly way back then at that time. We did geographic analysis plans, which did some master planning for oil and gas. We encouraged remote monitoring and a lot of things that were intended to reduce the cumulative impacts of Colorado. And prior to Senate Bill 181, there were a couple of cumulative impacts regulations on the books, and they had to do with encouraging directional drilling and with the consolidation of oil and gas production facilities in order to kind of keep them from becoming spotted across the landscape. And so it's something that's been in the mind of industry and of regulators and of Coloradans for quite some time. And I've heard, repeated from members of the public that since Senate Bill 181, that the Commission hasn't done anything to address cumulative impacts as required by 3460-106, which requires the COGCC and CDPHE to work together to evaluate and address the cumulative impacts of oil and gas development in Colorado. And that's just not the case. Much has been done since Senate Bill 181 as well. So pursuant to Senate Bill 181, several rulemakings were held. And one of those rulemakings was specifically a cumulative impacts rulemaking in direct response to this mandate that I just pointed out via statute. Since the cumulative impacts rulemaking, various regulations have been passed, and I think sometimes it's a little confusing because people don't see the words cumulative impacts in a specific regulation. But in reality, all regulations that are intended to limit operators in some way or mandate that they operate in a certain way often have their roots in addressing the impacts of oil and gas development on the landscape or on the environment or on people, and suggesting ways to mitigate, minimize, or avoid those impacts. And so many regulations are very much rooted in cumulative impacts. But that said, we had a specific cumulative impacts rulemaking, and what that did was established a repository, a database. So CIDR, it's called, the Cumulative Impacts Data Evaluation Repository, right, Sarah? Yeah. And the intent of that database is to gather data over time to help really understand the trends of oil and gas development and to address every year the cumulative impacts of Colorado. So it established that database. Again, we're just 2 years in. And it also established the gathering of cumulative impacts data in what we call Form 2B. And what that does is it requires, as part of an application package, it requires an operator to provide quantitative and qualitative data associated with subcategories in the primary categories of air, public health, water, wildlife resources, soil, and public welfare. And so there are a variety of issues, sub-issues under those issues that operators have to address in their application package and evaluate and assess the potential cumulative impacts of their proposed development. In addition to that, they also are required to evaluate all the proximate oil and gas locations that are proximate to the location that they're proposing in order to kind of gather a cumulative acres impacted type figure. And if certain triggers are met, they're also required to meet with other entities like CPW, CDPHE, surface owners, water system managers, and work together with those entities to come up with best management practices that identify the impacts and potential avenues to mitigate those impacts, or again, to avoid or minimize those impacts. And so all this takes place during the application period, which is one of the reasons that the application period is relatively lengthy in most cases. And then, pursuant to that, operators are required to put together an actual cumulative impacts plan associated with their application, which then kind of amalgamates all of these things, lists them all, and talks about all of the best management practices and other avenues that they're taking during the application period, well, not during the application period, that they're proposing during the application period to do during the construction and production period in order to minimize cumulative impacts. So all that is part of the application process, and so a lot of the cumulative impacts are handled a little bit behind the scenes as staff and industry work together during the application period to propose the best application that can be proposed. There are also various other cumulative impacts regulations associated with their applications. For example, in many cases, they'll have to put together an alternative location analysis, which then takes the area that they're planning to develop and proposes a number of locations from which they can develop, and a variety of criteria they go through to select whatever the best location is within their development to develop from. So again, trying to minimize cumulative impacts by selecting the very best location. And then cumulative impacts are built into many other regulations, as I pointed out. There are scattered throughout our regulations since the rulemaking. And one of the, and near and dear to my heart, because I participated in the Senate Bill 181 rulemaking as a member of CPW at the time, one of the good things that we did to minimize or to address the cumulative impacts was in the 1200 series, where we incorporated high priority habitat mapping, so that operators in their developments could work with CPW to plan around wildlife as well. And so a lot of people don't know that operators, when they propose a plan, have to propose a wildlife protection plan, even if their operation is outside of high priority habitat. And so that's part of the application process. If it's within high priority habitat, there are various avoidance, minimization, and mitigation structures that we then have to undertake together in order to, again, minimize the impact to wildlife. So, I guess I would summarize that point by saying that in the past, cumulative impacts has been on the minds of those who are developing oil and gas, and certainly on the minds of regulators and Coloradans. It has developed over time, and we did quite a bit early on to pass regulations that intended to minimize things. Certainly we have done much since Senate Bill 181 in order to improve our approach to evaluating and addressing cumulative impacts. And we've also set forth a structure for the future to evaluate cumulative impacts on an annual basis and propose recommendations to address and to assess and address cumulative impacts.
Thank you. It's quite the history, and there's a lot going on with cumulative impacts. So, Joe, from your perspective as the regulated entity, with these rules and these new forms and the lengthy application process we talked about, how has it changed your approach to how you look at applying for oil and gas development plans and cumulative impacts?
I think Commissioner Ackerman hit on quite a few of the facets. First, that there's been a tremendous amount of work done from a regulatory perspective in collaboration with industry and other stakeholders in the wake of Senate Bill 181. I think the tools in the toolbox were there to a certain extent, and what we've seen as the rules evolve is kind of more robust outline, which I think increases the transparency. And I think it was meant to kind of broaden the table and bring more folks to that decision-making process. But also, as referenced, there's an incredibly long lead time, and I think the regulatory and permitting folks, certainly at our company, Andy Lytle's team, are some of the best in the business. And this decision isn't made in a vacuum, and I think Commissioner Ackerman kind of referenced that. The months and months of work and collaboration between regulators, industry, local governments, stakeholders like landowners and other agencies comes together to present the application. And even at the point that the application is sent to the regulator, there's still a lot of changes that can evolve after that. So I think the rules are there, the tools are there, industry, regulators work together. I think we'll see a lot of evolution, as you referenced, moving forward. And I think people will continue to change.
Indeed. Great segue to the next question. So setting aside, some of the future initiatives and stakeholder outreach for now, as designed, Rule 904 and the cumulative impacts process was meant to be iterative. So, Commissioner Ackerman, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of how the COGCC expected cumulative impacts to iterate with the current rules.
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, like I mentioned, certainly cumulative impacts has been on the mind of COGCC commissioners, and as part of the establishment of the emission change rulemaking, as Sarah has mentioned in Rule 904A, I wasn't there at the time, but the commission put together a plan, a linear plan for in perpetuity for the assessment, and again, this is in response to 3460-106, the mandate to work together with CDPHE to evaluate and assess cumulative impacts, put together an annual plan. And so this report is essentially the vehicle that executes the annual plan to assess and address cumulative impacts in Colorado. So we just had the director report on this report. It's the second year that we've had it so far, and really in the first year there just wasn't much development, and so there wasn't much data in the first year. So we really have just kind of 1 year's worth of data. And the intent of that report is it requires that we report on the, as I mentioned earlier, the data that goes into the CIDR database. It requires that we recap the development for the year, and that we identify and evaluate any trends that are emerging. Now, as the director is fond of saying, we have 2 points, and 2 points, make a line, don't necessarily make a trend, but we'll work in that direction where we understand what the trends are, and that report's going to help us do that. And then also the report identifies any more and new information like emerging technologies or studies, governmental or scholarly studies that have taken place with regard to cumulative impacts of oil and gas development. And then also, and most importantly, the report provides recommendations each year of here are some trends that we're seeing, here are some recommendations on things that we could do to handle them. And those recommendations might result in rulemakings, they might result in policy changes, they might result in studies or a number of other things. And most importantly, I think the report is intended to be annual. So the commission set up kind of this linear process in response to Senate Bill 181 that would provide for, in perpetuity, the annual reevaluation of cumulative impacts and the tweaking of our regulations and policies and practices potentially on an annual basis to address those cumulative impacts. Now, I would point out also that I think many of you are probably aware that there are other cumulative impacts processes going on right now. And so when the commission set this up in a linear fashion, I'm not sure that we anticipated that we would get some great governor directives associated with the reduction of ozone precursors, with the evaluation and incorporation of the Environmental Justice Task Force results into our regulations. You might be aware that I'm running a stakeholder evaluation process, a stakeholder outreach process associated with cumulative impacts. But aside from all and certainly potential legislation that could come forth from this session that will address cumulative impacts as well. But aside from all those things, the commission had the foresight to set up, again, this annual process that will, regardless of all these other processes, assess and address cumulative impacts on an annual basis.
Thank you. So, Joe, we're turning to you. Now that we're a couple of years in, what do you see as current challenges in this assessment and evaluation of cumulative impacts?
Well, I think we've kind of hit on some of them. I think this perception that the decisions are made in a vacuum is a challenging one that we will navigate. And then I think the avoid, mitigate, minimize, as that kind of floats around, what order do we place things? I think you see different potential cumulative impacts having different potential weights, and I think there'll be some conversations and collaboration that will continue to play out in this evolutionary course of action that the Commission's taking to ensure that we kind of get the right things in play here as we navigate. If you're close closer to town, obviously you have a different set of receptors, but as you go out into the rural areas, you're going to run into receptors from the wildlife side of things, and how do we balance some of these best management practices, appropriate mitigations, et cetera. I think that'll be something that we're looking to wrap our heads around moving forward.
So it's a bigger picture look these days. I'm going to stick with you for just a second. So again, setting aside for a moment the stakeholder outreach process that I promise we'll get to that. Can you explain how cumulative impacts is evolving, how you expect cumulative impacts to be evolving as a regulated entity?
I think, as the commissioner kind of stated, the new and emerging technologies and best management practices, I think that process is pretty iterative, and there's some real gains that are coming. Obviously, our focus is more in the DJ Basin, so we have that kind of lens that we look at. But I think on the completion side, the emission side, the drilling side, these different tools in the toolbox that come into play, I think give regulators and industry a good path forward on a one-size-fits-all doesn't always work, and we have to look at site by site, and we have the tools to do so. So I think that paired with a little bit more time to get, instead of 2 points on the linear data, to kind of develop that trend, I think the annual report is a positive thing that will continue to be positive, and I think that will color that evolution that we're talking about.
Perfect. And we're going to end our prepared questions, so get ready with your own with Commissioner Ackerman. So this year the COGCC initiated a stakeholder outreach process to really look at how the COGCC continues its approach to addressing and evaluating cumulative impacts. Can you give an overview of that process, where we are, and what you see the next steps are?
Sure, yeah. A little funny story associated with that. So Director Gibbs mentioned the Wolf Project, which has been, as you might be aware, a very big issue. And so I was assigned to work on that project when I worked for CPW. And when the governor appointed me to this position, I guess I won't say publicly that one of the great things about that was I got to leave the Wolf Project in the hands of Director Gibbs and others. But shortly after I was appointed here, I got a call from Director Murphy and from Chair Robbins and said, "Hey, how'd you like to address a process that lead a process that addresses the entirety of cumulative impacts of oil and gas development in the state of Colorado?" And so I couldn't help but give him a hard time and think that he saw that I got to rest for a second there. But this is a big undertaking. It's a big undertaking and something that matters to essentially everyone. And so I'm excited that we're talking about it. And I'm an eternal optimist. I believe that most people want to do good. I believe that, and my experience has been that people in the industry, if they see what the target is and they understand what the target is and they know what they're aiming for, are very willing to aim for that target because they want to continue to do business and they want to continue to do so in the best way possible. I see that there are, advocates for conservation and for the environment. And as the commissioner who sits in the environmental and wildlife seat, I'm very interested in making sure that as we do this, if we've decided that we're going to develop oil and gas in the state of Colorado, and we have, then we need to do so in the most environmentally and conservation-friendly way possible. And so, with industry being informed on what those targets are and being able to collaborate on what those targets are, because they have certainly environmental expertise within industry, I think we can find ways to collaborate with citizens, with environmental advocates, and find really the best path forward. And I circle back to being an eternal optimist because the end goal here is the same, which is to make sure that we're doing so in a way that leaves the environment intact and in the best condition that we can for our posterity. And it's very important to me. So I think as part of the stakeholder process, that's one of the most important outcomes, is to get to a place where we all feel like we're doing this in the best way that we possibly can. So we began the process in January, and we held 4 public meetings. They were all virtual, and we also took written public comment. And we received 124 unique comments that touched on a variety of subjects. And if you want kind of a detailed report on that, on March 15th at the commission hearing, I provided a relatively detailed report to the commission. And so you can go to our YouTube channel and take a look at that. And as well, we have a Cumulative Impacts webpage, and all of the comments that we received are included in their entirety on that webpage. And so that was kind of the first step. It was a bit of a scoping, to use a federal term. It was a bit of a scoping process to see what the issues were that were out there, and we received a wide variety of comments. And so now we're in the phase where we've got that going on, and as I mentioned before, the annual cumulative impacts report going on. And so we took some public comment this past Monday on the annual cumulative impacts report, and the intent going forward is to kind of bring that together into one cumulative impacts process. And so now we're in the stages of kind of formulating the continuation of the scoping period and where to go from here forward. So on May 2nd, I'll propose to the Commission kind of a path forward on what we do next and what we do with those comments that we received. So that hasn't been formulated yet. We're in the process of doing so, but tune in on May 2nd for that. But again, I would reiterate that the Commission will continue to address cumulative impacts, again, in response to a statutory mandate. We work closely with CDPHE on a very consistent and ongoing basis to do so. We work closely with industry, and we continue to welcome all input to the cumulative impacts process. So stay tuned. It's likely to be a lengthy process. It's likely to be an involved process. But I think one of the most important things we need to do at this stage is to understand all of the many cumulative impacts pathways that are going on and try not to duplicate, overlap, and kind of sort things out into their appropriate processes. That's kind of where we stand right now.
Right. So before I turn it to questions, just to summarize up a few things. A lot of what I heard today is continuous collaboration and evolution. So we're not done talking about this project and cumulative impacts generally. So left alone in its state as the Commission originally designed it, it was meant to evolve and iterate. But so much has also happened since then, such as the the EJ task force and their recommendations to the governor's letters, legislative sessions. So a lot of that is also informing where we go with cumulative impacts. And so the next steps and the next big evolution is just beginning, and we're ready to continue those discussions. That's what I heard from these folks today. Would love to open it up to you for additional questions.
I have a question. In addition to the CIDR database and the annual director report, I'm wondering how COGCC staff and/or commissioners take the cumulative impacts data or information provided by the operator into account when looking at a specific application. So, for example, if that application is accompanied by certain cumulative impacts data that are high on the scale of however we measure them, does staff take that into account when looking at that application?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. I couldn't see where that question was coming from, so I apologize. But okay, thank you. Yeah, and I alluded to this in my comments, and certainly, don't have as much of the detail on the exact staff interactions with industry, as I don't get to see those. But yes, the answer to your question is yes. The cumulative impacts analysis that the operator puts together during the application period, one might think it's just the submittal of an application, and then that application goes to the director for the director's recommendation, and then that application goes to us if the director recommends approval for the commission approval. And that's just not the case. As a matter of fact, in the application packet, you'll often see this application was remanded back to the operator on 1, 2, 3 occasions to address certain issues associated with the application. And so that's a formal remanding back, but throughout the application period, there's constant communication between industry and our staff that says, here's what we're thinking about proposing with regard to this specific issue. What do you think? Yeah, we think that's good. That's, we see that as industry standard too, or we see the trends going towards being more conservative in this area. And so as far as any specifics, if there were any, we could try to address those, but I do think that it's important to understand that there's consistent and constant collaboration between the submittal of all data on the application, including the cumulative impacts report and cumulative impacts portion of the data, and our staff, and continued suggestions on improvement of applications before they ever get to the director for the director's recommendation. So, good question, thank you.
And before they're even applied for formally, too. And I think the collaboration between staff extends to other agencies as well, in addition to the COGCC.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Steve Soychak, Colorado Mesa University. So when you talk about cumulative impacts, it's primarily the negative impacts. A few years ago, we had Chris Wright here from Liberty Energy Services, and their company recently put out an ESG report on bettering humanity, how hydrocarbons better humanity. Have you ever considered looking at the positive impacts of what would it be like without a hydrocarbon society that we would have, instead of just looking at the negative impacts?
I could kind of start off. I think actually, as part of the cumulative impacts narrative that's incumbent in the permits, there are some elements to how the operator engages in that local community, and a lot of that has to do with potential economic benefits as well. And I think that will continue to play a role as we talked about this kind of evolution. And I know there's another panel on the environmental justice side, but I think that kind of fits into some of the balancing out of the benefits as well.
Yeah, thank you, and appreciate the question, and appreciate the work that your organization is doing with regard to geothermal energy. A great leader in geothermal energy, so thank you for that work. And I think it's a great question, and we regulate to avoid the negative. That's just kind of the purpose of regulation, right? I used to call it the lowest common denominator, but I don't do that anymore. We see the negative, we regulate to avoid the negative. And so regulations, as you pointed out, are often focused on addressing the negative cumulative impacts. That said, we are reminded often of the positive impacts of oil and gas development. And, I always say, if we're going to have a conversation, let's have a real conversation about it, right? Each one of us every day in our everyday lives, as has been stated in this conference today, use oil and gas products, right? And so if we're going to have a discussion about minimizing oil and gas, we need to have the whole discussion about what that does to lifestyle, what that does to industry, what that does economically, what that does across the board. And so those are all positive impacts of oil and gas development that we do have to take into account. And I think where it really comes into play is when, as a regulator, you have to keep in mind that every issue and every industry has a tipping point. And if you can regulate all the negative impacts to some degree, but there is a tipping point at some point where you impact the industry in such a way that that industry either ceases to exist or it is curtailed significantly. And so those are all things that we do have to keep in mind as regulators as we think about oil and gas. But we regulate the negative impacts, but we certainly have to keep in mind the positive contributions of all sides of the issue. So, good question.
Joe mentioned the challenges, the limitations of a one-size-fits-all approach to the cumulative impacts. Can you talk a little bit about the challenge of, say, a project on the Front Range in Weld County versus, say, Garfield County, where there are going to be different variables between those two projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a great question, and the variability is significant because not only do you have variability in practices amongst operators, there are a lot of industry standards, but there are different kinds of developments. And we spent some time in the Raton Basin as a commission recently, and the operations in the Raton Basin are significantly different than operations elsewhere. We spent some time on the Eastern Plains. Again, operations on a well-by-well basis are significantly different than elsewhere. Operations out here on the Western Slope are significantly different than those in the DJ Basin. And not only are operations different from an operational perspective, topography is different, limitations are different, the necessary technologies are different in different locations. Certainly out here on the West Slope, and particularly in the Northwest region, wildlife is a huge issue, right? Significant wildlife habitat out here, and our whole state is great wildlife habitat, but very significant and targeted wildlife habitat out here. And so we do try to stay away from a one-size-fits-all, and when we do, that's one of the challenges of regulations, is that you have to set a standard. And so when we set that standard, it's very important that we collaborate with all entities to understand what limitations are. And we certainly have bumped up against proposals before where industry or others have said, hey, that leaves this avenue open, or no, this makes it impossible for us to reach the goal that we're intending to reach with this regulation. So it's a great point and a very difficult balance to reach when you're setting regulations that are intended to regulate an industry. And one of the ways that we address that is through, and people have a difficult time with, well, you have a standard, but then you have exceptions to the standard, right, with waiver processes and other things. And it's necessitated that we do set up those standards, that we have a standard that we generally adhere to, but in certain circumstances, in certain locations, certain challenges, there does need to be a process in order to move things forward, or to say, well, this is an area that, we do have some no surface occupancy areas, that this is an area that we need to stay away from. So it's a great question, and it's a balancing act in any form of regulation, not just oil and gas.